night was a shroud, heavy and unyielding, draped over the quiet expanse of rural Indiana. It was December 14th, 2016, a Wednesday cloaked in winter's grip, where the air hung still and the world seemed to hold its breath. Brian, a 32-year-old mechanic with grease-stained hands and a life carved from routine, lived alone in a small, weathered house at the end of a winding dirt road. The forest encircled his home, tall, barren oaks and pines standing like skeletal guards, their branches clawing at a sky smothered by thick gray clouds. Inside, the clock's hands had crept past 11 p.m., its faint tick swallowed by the silence that pressed against the walls. The day had been long, the cold relentless, and Brian had one last task before retreating to the warmth of his bed: taking out the trash. He shrugged on a threadbare jacket, its zipper catching briefly on the fabric, and hefted a trash bag over his shoulder. The plastic crinkled softly as he pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under his weight, a low, mournful sound that faded into the night. The cold struck him immediately, sharp and unforgiving, sinking its teeth into his exposed skin. His breath puffed out in slow, white clouds, curling upward before dissolving into the dark. The porch light flickered overhead, a weak, buzzing glow that painted the yard in sickly yellow hues, its reach faltering just beyond the gravel driveway. The trash bin waited 30 feet away, near the edge of the property where the forest loomed, its shadows deep and impenetrable, a wall of black that seemed to pulse with secrets. Brian adjusted the bag, his boots crunching against the frost-dusted gravel as he started across the yard. Each step echoed faintly, a solitary rhythm in the stillness, the frozen ground glinting underfoot like shattered glass. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, tinged with the bite of winter. He was halfway to the bin, his mind drifting to the warmth of his couch, when something pierced the quiet, a sound low and guttural, drifting from the tree line. It wasn't the wind, not the rustle of branches. It was sharper, more deliberate, a clicking, like the chatter of teeth or the tap of claws against stone. Brian froze, the trash bag slipping slightly in his grip, his breath hitching as the sound rolled over him. He tilted his head, ears straining to pinpoint it. The clicking came again, rhythmic, insistent, seeping out of the darkness like a whisper meant only for him. His heart gave a slow, heavy thud, a primal drumbeat against his ribs. The forest stared back, its shadows twisting in the dim light. Or was that his imagination? He squinted, eyes tracing the line where the trees met the yard, where the frost gave way to blackness. The sound grew louder, closer, a steady pulse that clawed at the edges of his nerves. Something was out there, something alive, something moving. His fingers tightened around the bag, the plastic slick against his palm, as he took a cautious step back. And then he saw it. From the gap between two gnarled oaks, a figure unfolded itself into the night. Slowly, deliberately, as if the shadows had parted to birth it. It was tall, 8 feet at least, maybe more, but it didn't stand upright. It crouched low, its long, bony limbs bent at angles that twisted Brian's stomach into knots. Its skin was pale, a sickly white that shimmered faintly in the clouded gloom, stretched taut over a frame so thin it seemed to defy physics. The arms, those unnatural arms, dangled past its knees, swaying slightly, ending in fingers too long, too sharp, tipped with claw-like nails that caught the porch light in brief, wicked glints. Its legs bent backward at the joints, like some grotesque insect, and its head, bald, tilted at an angle that made no sense, bore no features save for two dark, hollow sockets, black pits where eyes should have been. Brian stood paralyzed, the trash bag forgotten, its weight pulling at his arm as his mind scrambled for sense. The creature didn't move, not yet. It simply crouched there, those eyeless sockets fixed on him, unblinking, unrelenting. The clicking ceased, replaced by a silence so dense it pressed against his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs until each breath felt like a gasp. His thoughts raced. Bear? No, too gaunt. Deer? Not with those limbs. A man in a costume? No mask could mimic that pallor, that wrongness. This was no trick of the light, no animal he'd ever known. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. The cold deepened, the frost beneath his boots biting through the soles, but he barely felt it. His eyes locked on that pale, gaunt form, its stillness more terrifying than any motion. The night seemed to shrink, the trees leaning closer, the shadows thickening until it was just him and that thing, alone in a world gone quiet. His pulse hammered, a frantic rhythm against the silence, and for a moment he wondered if it could hear it, if those hollow sockets could sense the blood rushing through his veins. Then it moved. With a sudden, jerking lunge, the creature surged forward, its limbs flailing in a disjointed, scuttling rush that shattered the stillness. It didn't run. It crawled, fast and unnatural, its claws scraping the frozen ground with sound like nails dragged across a chalkboard. 20 feet became 10 in mere seconds, the distance collapsing as Brian stumbled backward, the trash bag tumbling free and bursting open across the gravel. His foot caught on a rock, and he nearly fell, his hands flailing as a jolt of raw fear shot through him. The thing was close now, too close, the hiss of its movements slicing through the night, sharp and relentless. He turned and ran. His boots pounded the earth, each step a desperate cry for distance, the cold air searing his lungs as he sucked it in. The house loomed ahead, the porch light a flickering beacon, but it felt miles away, a distant promise against the terror at his heels. The clicking was back, sharper now, faster, joined by a low, rasping hiss that clawed at his spine, burrowing into his skull. He didn't look back, couldn't, but he felt it, the weight of its presence, the sense of something long and pale and wrong bearing down on him. His hand hit the doorknob, slick with sweat despite the freezing night, and he twisted it, shoving himself inside with force that rattled the hinges. The door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place as he threw his weight against it. Chest heaving, ears straining for the sound he dreaded. Silence fell at first, just a thud of his heart, the rasp of his breath, the faint hum of the heater kicking on inside. Then a scrape, slow, deliberate, like claws dragging across the wooden siding. Brian's stomach twisted, his breath catching as the sound moved, tracing the house's exterior, down the wall, around the corner, a predator testing its boundaries. His hands trembled, pressing harder against the door as if his weight alone could keep it out. The scrape paused, then started again, circling, relentless, a promise whispered in the dark. He slid to the floor, back pressed to the wood, his knees drawn up as his eyes darted to the window across the room. The blinds were open, the glass a black mirror reflecting the dim glow inside. And there it was. The creature crouched outside, its pale form hunched low, its eyeless face pressed close to the pane. Those hollow sockets stared, unwavering, as if they could see through the walls, through his skin, into the marrow of his bones. Its head tilted further, a slow, unnatural twist that sent a shiver racing down his spine. 10 seconds passed, then 20, then 30, each one an eternity as it lingered there motionless, watching. Brian's breath stopped, his chest tight, his fingers digging into his legs. Then, with a sudden twitch, it dropped out of sight, vanishing into the night. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling. Brian didn't move. He stayed there, curled against the door, until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the blinds, painting the room in a cold, muted glow. Only then did he stand, legs unsteady, and peer outside. The yard was empty, the trash scattered where he dropped it, bits of paper fluttering in the faint breeze. But there, near the porch, the frost bore tracks, long, narrow impressions, too large for any man or beast, spaced unevenly as if left by something that moved in ways it shouldn't. He didn't sleep that day. He called in sick to work, his voice a hollow echo on the phone, and locked every door and window, checking each latch twice. He pulled a shotgun from the closet and sat with it across his lap, the metal cold against his thighs, listening for that clicking to return. It didn't. Not that night, nor the next, nor the one after. On December 21st, 2016, a week later, he reported it to a local cryptozoology group, his words clipped and steady, though his hands shook as he typed. He didn't want fame or pity. He wanted answers, some thread of reason to tether him to the world he'd known before. None came. The woods behind his house stayed quiet, but Brian didn't trust the silence. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the dark, sent his heart racing, his eyes darting to the windows. He knew what he'd seen that night. Something real, something alive, something that had watched him with a hunger he couldn't name. And deep down in the marrow of his bones, he feared it was still out there, waiting in the shadows, its claws poised to scrape against his walls once more.